I'm going to share with you a reflection, and it's probably true to say that the guy I'm going to talk about for a few minutes knew what it was to try and flee, to think that the darkness might hide him, to be in a crisis, let's just say. Those of you that have been here on and off over the last few weeks will have discovered that I am slowly making my way through the life of Elijah. And last week we looked at the story on the top of Mount Carmel when there had been the great battle between the prophets of Baal and their sacrifice, and between Elijah and the sacrifice that he had prepared. But first, he had prepared the altar of the Lord. And we looked at how significant that was, that first he rebuilt the place of worship before he called on the Lord. And we looked at his simple prayer, which was not, Lord, send your fire and burn up this sacrifice. If you have a look at it, it's quite a simple prayer. Lord, I want the glory to go to you, and I want these people to see that you are God. Simple prayer. So after the sacrifice of the Lord had been burned, despite all the water that was poured on it, we have the situation where Elijah commanded that the prophets of Baal be slaughtered. And Ahab the king returned to the city. So I'm going to read from 1 Kings 19, verses 1 to 5, which is the bit that follows on from that story. And just at the end of all of that, the rains had come. The clouds had formed, and the rains were just about on their way after 3 years of drought. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah to say, "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them." Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life. I'm no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. Jezebel, of course, being King Ahab's wife, sent Elijah a message, certainly of fear and intimidation. Whether she intended to carry out the threat to kill him, don't know. I wonder if she hoped that he would run away and then he wouldn't be her problem anymore. I don't know. Because certainly if she killed him, there would be a backlash from the people. And maybe she even in her deepest, darkest part of her heart thought that God might not be too pleased either, even though she didn't believe in him. And I'm so glad that this chapter's in the Bible, because it means that the biblical heroes are real. They are real. We don't get the glorified big screen version where all the kind of the weak points of life are brushed over. There is reality here. They stand up to the mark, they struggle, they fall, just like we do. So why did Elijah run? Why did he flee? It says he's afraid. There's no shame in being afraid, is there? I've heard Elijah in various sermons down through the years described as a wuss, a coward, succumbing to the threat of a woman, A wet shirt, how the mighty have fallen, a failure, and maybe even a disappointment to God. The hero turned disappointment. What do you think? Are they fair, those descriptions? I don't think so. I don't think so. My goodness, if they are fair descriptions, then every time I get something wrong, then I am also a wet shirt, a disappointment to God, and so on. And I don't think that's right. I think there might be something else going on here. I've never been quite satisfied with the idea that Elijah went weak at the knees at the threat from this woman. Because after all, he'd been to see Ahab and stand in front of him to tell him that drought was coming. That takes courage. So is this man really going to crumble when a lady sends a message and says, I'm going to have your life? He's been under threat before. Why cave in now? Why do something that seems the complete opposite of all that he stood for and fought for until now? So I just want to re-look at the circumstances that have led to this point and then ponder with you the possibility of what might have happened. We know there was drought in the land. Elijah, by the word of the Lord, told King Ahab. People have undoubtedly died through this drought, 3 years at least. Crops and animals have been ruined. Maybe he feels some responsibility. He was only the messenger, but nevertheless he wouldn't have been able to escape the devastation around him. He's lived through some mighty difficult circumstances. There was those faith-testing times when he was in isolation at the Kerith Ravine, when God provided the food by the ravens and the water from the brook, and then of course the brook dried up because of the drought. But he could have turned on God and said, what are you doing, God? Why did you send me to this place only for the water to fail? Then he journeyed across lands of drought where we know the prophets were being hunted. Then he ended up in Zarephath, the place of the fiery trials. That's what the name means. So he went from, you could say, the frying pan into the fire, literally a place of furnaces. He's been before Ahab several times. At Zarephath, they had to live by faith with the flour and oil every day. And then, of course, the lady that he lived with, her son died. And I'm sure he prayed for the son, but he died anyway. And he had to go before the Lord. He's commanded this situation on Carmel. He alone, among 450 prophets and the people of the land and the king. And the fire of God came down and he had the prophets killed. We're not sure, doesn't specify whether God told him to kill the prophets or whether in that situation he deemed it was the only thing that he could do. How does he feel about it? The lives of all these people now lost. Then we know he ran like the wind back to Jezreel, ahead of the chariot that Ahab was in. He must be exhausted. Now there's been a direct threat made to his life. I heard the other day of a new word that's been put in the Collins Dictionary this year. It was mentioned at the Prayer Partners weekend that's just finished. A permacrisis. If you think about permafrost, where there's frost all the time, a permacrisis. A permanent state of being in crisis, one after the other, overlapping. You can never get to the end of something before something else is upon you. You may have had times like that in your life. You may be in one now, where it just feels like wherever you turn, you're in crisis. There is no escape. Undoubtedly, Elijah is exhausted physically. He may be malnourished, we don't know. Exhausted emotionally. Perhaps he's lost a sense of perspective because of it. He's been living under extreme strain for 3 years, and now he's commanded a massacre. Rather than Elijah going weak at the knees at the threat from Jezebel, I think the threat from Jezebel was the tipping point for him, tipping him from coping to being overwhelmed. And we all know what that's like, don't we? We're coping, and suddenly something happens, and it could be even quite minor. And suddenly we've gone from coping to overwhelmed, and we are completely lost. Crises, I think we all know what it is to have a crisis in life, large ones, small ones. Usually they come abruptly, little or no warning, and we're plunged into a situation where we are tested. Might be an emergency. All through my nursing days, we were always taught about the primitive response that is in us when we feel that we are in danger. What is it? Fight or flight. Fight or flight. And there is a third one, actually, freeze. But that's no help at all. Freeze is no help at all. And I sense that Elijah he was so overwhelmed, he was in that sense of fight or flight because of the fact that he was just so overwhelmed, so stressed. At what point for you does coping turn to overwhelmed? I wonder. I think Elijah's has just been breached. And the more I've thought about it, the more I think that there is still something else going on here. And when I was originally thinking about this period in Elijah's life, I had an extraordinary experience. And I'm sure it was a God moment, because I woke up in the early hours of the morning with this thought: Elijah's got PTSD. He's got PTSD. That's what's going on for him. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which wouldn't have been a biblical descriptor at the time. So I started to have a look. The commentators don't mention it. There were a couple of little bits online that I found where other people thought Elijah might have PTSD. So I thought, oh, good, I'm not alone then. I'm not alone. PTSD, to put it basically, is any situation that a person finds traumatic, where there is real or perceived, and it doesn't matter which it is, threat to life. Now, Elijah had a threat to life, didn't he? On top of all of his situations that he'd been through. It's no wonder that we see PTSD a lot these days amongst those who put their lives on the front line, the police, the military, healthcare workers through COVID. It can develop immediately, or it can develop weeks, months later. And I think if we think back to the First World War, and now the name's gone out of my head. What was it called? When soldiers ran away and they were court-martialed. No, there wasn't there. Did I write it down somewhere? Shell shock. Shell shock. Yeah, shell shock. Yeah. Where people were shot for either fleeing or freezing in the midst of battle. If we look at Elijah's behaviour in the light of PTSD, what happens next and onwards begins to make some sense, I think. he runs. He runs 100 miles away. Yes, okay, perhaps he runs away from the threat, but he abandons his servant on the way. That's not rational, is it? He leaves his servant behind and goes on alone. His life alone, running into the desert, has got to be more at risk, surely. He sits under a tree and he prays, "Let me die, Lord. I've had enough." That's what the words literally mean. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. And I wonder in there, is there a clue that he's looking back on the Old Testament stories that he would have known well and all those situations of battle and death, and he's thinking, and I thought I was going to do this a bit better. I thought I was going to manage this better, and now here I am, just like them, and I've been responsible for all that loss of life. Whether I'm right or not, I think we can agree that Elijah is past his tipping point of coping and is completely overwhelmed. I wonder if he's even trying to run away from God. Running away from himself, probably at a stage of complete mental, physical, spiritual collapse. I wonder if you've suffered with it to some degree or other. And it can be in all sorts of other circumstances. You know, the numbing experiences of everyday life, bereavement, rejection, relationship breakdown, loss of trust, financial collapse. It doesn't have to be somebody standing before you with a gun. The threat to life can be perceived, that may not always be in a way that's obvious. So if you reflect over your lives, especially through the time of COVID, there was a very real threat to life for people through COVID, wasn't there? And when you were in those times, when you were struggling to cope, how did you feel physically, spiritually, emotionally, as though you've got nothing left in you anymore? Can't fight anymore, can't cope anymore. It's a good job, isn't it, that God doesn't answer all of our prayers. He didn't take Elijah literally at this point. He didn't take his life. And I'm not going to dwell today on what God did in response to Elijah. That's going to be next week. We're going to leave Elijah under the broom tree, asleep. Probably one of the things he needed most. Because sometimes I think we go through dark, difficult struggles, and there isn't always an easy end, is there? So we're going to leave Elijah in his struggle under the broom tree. We know that God does come to him and take him through it. Actually, Elijah has quite a lot of work to do to get through it, and we will see that. But for the moment, we're going to leave him asleep. But if you are in a place of struggle or chaos or crisis or something, God is with you. You may not feel that he is, because our feelings don't always tell us the truth. But he is. He was with Elijah, and we'll see that, and he is with you.